Chapter 18. Friendly Fire. Reyes was back in the air and flying south. Before long, he and his 2 bodyguards were crossing the border and entering the dukedom of the Moth. "That was a mistake, boss," Tanegi was chiding. "We were lucky they didn't kill you for wasting their time." "I know," Reyes replied unhappily, "but I had to try. Goatee's army might be 7,000 strong, but it won't be enough." "We should have killed that Libna while we had the chance," Chief Quinnigoff suggested. Reyes thought about that as he flew. Libna hadn't truly left his village because she hadn't been a member of it. She hadn't betrayed him by leaving, even if Quinnigoff tended to think otherwise. "She's free to go where she wishes." "I hope she finds a home in the mountains," Tanegi commented. "I liked her." In the end, it was disappointing that Libna had left. Reyes would have to admit that he had liked her too. There was something about her that almost made him want to like her. The whole day seemed to have been a failure. He had been so confident that the Harpies would follow the reincarnation of Lambington the Eternal, regardless of what side she was taking in the war, that he really hadn't bothered to prepare any kind of heartwarming speech. It was bad enough that just 2 leaders had arrived at the meeting, but when neither of them seemed willing to take him at face value, the whole trip fell flat. To think, he could have been back with his girlfriend hours ago. At least he had the painting. "See you in Arliss," Libna had said upon parting. Yes, maybe he would see her there, but on whose side would she be fighting? The weather was beginning to turn very nasty. Reyes and his bodyguards soon found themselves flying in the middle of a blizzard. It was hard to see much of what lay ahead. The snow was falling thick and fast, and this time it was settling. It also obscured the King's Eastern Highway, coating it in the same shade of white as the trees and the fields on either side. Reyes found he had to fly quite low just to follow the road. Had Reyes flown straight back after his trip to the Centaur's Gift, not only would he now be in the arms of his beloved girlfriend, but he and his bodyguards would have missed the worst of the weather. The trip to the Hennick's farm had been a waste of time, but Reyes hadn't known that, and had suggested an early evening meeting to give the attendees as much time as possible to get there. Now, with the sun already beginning to sink below the distant horizon, Reyes was only too aware that it was going to be dark before he got home. "We should stop for the night, boss," Tanegi suggested. It was a comment that Reyes had feared. It was getting late, but there was still time for his huntresses to catch something for dinner before it got too much darker. On the other hand, the encampment was so close. Reyes felt as if he could almost smell it. The vision of his beloved came into his mind. There would be food at the encampment. They could eat when they got home. "We'll fly on a little longer." "We really should land," my Chief Quinnigoff advised worriedly. She seemed to be trying to fly with her head tucked into one of her arms in an attempt to keep the snow out of her eyes. "Not only is it getting dark, but the weather is getting worse. We should sit out the storm." "We fly on," Reyes insisted. He had to see Gagara again. He tried to glance in Quinnigoff's direction, but could hardly see her. "I wish I could see," Tanegi commented. "Feel free to wait here," Reyes shouted back at them. "I'm going on, even if I have to walk." "Then I'm staying with you, my Chief," Quinnigoff promised. "I just don't think it's wise since I can't see that far ahead. I can barely see you." Reyes shivered with the cold. At least by flying they were doing something to keep them a little warmer. If they landed and tried to walk, they would probably freeze in short order. If they made camp, they would have trouble lighting a fire to keep themselves warm. They would have to find some kind of natural shelter to wait out the storm, and with everything covered in snow, that wasn't going to be easy. Even without snow hiding the road Reyes was trying to follow, flying in this weather proved to be quite a challenge. The usual 10 to 12 miles an hour that Reyes could manage was slowed down to a mere crawl. The cold was getting to him. The snow settled on his wings and back faster than it melted off, weighing him down just a little bit and making him feel colder still. There was even a time when he considered switching to his horse and clothing. The clothes would help keep him a little bit warmer. The horse was quite fast. He might even gain time. He decided against it though. He might feel more comfortable that way, but what about his 2 bodyguards? In the end he felt it was better that he stayed with the other 2 in the air. Up here they could support each other better by suffering together through this snowstorm. As for any further thoughts of food and hunting, there seemed to be no sign of life anywhere. Well, it was true that Reyes couldn't see all that well anyway. His ears were sensitive enough to pick up the subtle little differences in the sounds of nature. It seemed as if every living creature in this part of the world was currently huddled up in a shelter of some kind. Everything that was, except for the 3 harpies flying overhead. It was dark when Reyes and his 2 bodyguards reached the remains of the ruined city of Lambington. It was a city of dust and ash, a city of black lines that outlined where the buildings had once stood. Only a few buildings had survived, and even then they had been gutted and were missing a wall or 2. The whole thing was covered in thick snow. There, in the middle of what had been the city green, were several dozen canvas tents with small fires raging between them. The army that the elves had brought to besiege the city had long since moved on, and the army of occupation that the elves had earmarked to guard the population of the city had had no purpose in hanging around the city, since there was no one here to guard. They too were long gone. Clearly the tents had to belong to someone else. Reyes began to look for clues. There seemed to be no one down there by which to judge who the owners of these tents were. Reyes could well imagine that there might be a small army of elven soldiers, possibly skirmishers, considering what Manglos had told Reyes earlier, keeping warm by the fire and ducking into the relative shelter of the tents to get out of the snow. And maybe they would have something in the tents to help keep them warm. The fires were still burning, so they hadn't taken shelter all that long ago. Unless there was someone down there tending to the fires while the others took shelter. Chances were there would also be lookouts. Elves scattered about the camp, keeping an eye on anything coming from whatever direction. If they truly knew where the encampment was, then they would probably be concentrating their attention in that direction. Reyes couldn't see anyone. In this light, and with this snow, he was lucky to have even seen the tents. It was only because they were partly lit by the surrounding campfires that he had. "I think that's the remains of the city, my chief," Quinnigoff commented. "I see some fires burning down there. Maybe we should take advantage of them." Reyes shivered with the cold. They really weren't very far from the encampment now, and it probably wasn't a very wise idea to land in the middle of an elven camp, but those campfires were just so enticing. Maybe they could stop there for a few minutes, restore their body heat back to a reasonable level, and then fly the rest of the way to the encampment. It was even possible they might be able to get a little bit of information out of one of the elves. Find out what they did know, why they were in the area, that sort of thing. Perhaps it was all just a coincidence that the elves were in this part of the country and they hadn't come here looking for the human encampment. "Okay," Reyes agreed, shivering with the cold. "Just for a short while, just enough to take the edge off, and when I say we go, we go. No argument." "I'll check the place is safe," Quinnigoff replied eagerly. Then she flew forward at a fast pace, seeming to cut through the falling snow like a scythe. Quinnigoff landed a little awkwardly. She seemed to be somewhat surprised at how the snow reacted to her underfoot. She was forced by her own inertia to run forward a few steps, almost stumbling into the nearest fire. Her landing hadn't gone unnoticed. Somewhere in the camp an alarm started to sound. It was like a loud gong being hit repeatedly and stirring the inhabitants of the tents from their rest. In what little light there was, it was hard to make out much detail of the soldiers who had begun to emerge from the tents. At least there was a little bit of light, thanks to the burning fires. From what little Reyes could see, the emerging soldiers weren't just wearing one type of uniform. There appeared to be at least 3 different regiments. In the few cases where Reyes could actually make out any detail, the soldiers' armour appeared to be quite grimy, as if it had been worn constantly for several days on end. The soldiers were armed with a variety of weapons, from simple short swords to huge double-bladed war axes. There was also one other detail, something that told Reyes he had totally miscalculated who the occupants of this camp were. These people were human. The uniforms being worn, when Reyes looked at them again, were those of the Lambington militia, the Dumoff Castle Guard and the Gnespa Castle Guard. "Let me sort this out," Reyes instructed Tanegi. "Boss," Tanegi responded. Reyes didn't stay to clarify his order. Time was of the essence. He certainly didn't have all that long. Right now the human soldiers would be hanging back from the harpy. She might be alone, but being a harpy she was very strong, and one-on-one might easily get the better of anyone who tried to attack her. What was most likely was that the humans would surround her and keep her occupied, or someone with a bow lined up a shot and took her out from a distance. "Don't shoot," Reyes shouted from the sky as he came in to land. He landed right beside Quinnigoff. It was almost a perfect landing, but he was too worried to congratulate himself over it. Once he was on the ground, he tried to place himself between the largest part of the gathering crowd and his bodyguard. He lifted his hands high above his head, trying to show that he wasn't dangerous. "We come in peace." It was hard to concentrate. Reyes had been so cold and the heat from the nearby fire so welcome on his body that it was all he could do to not just turn and face the fire to get warm. Come in peace, someone repeated, laughing as he said it. You're a harpy, one of the humans directed the comment right at him. Reyes could hear the stringing of bows and knocking of arrows. He and Quinagoff could take to the air, but they would just be shot down. If they stayed put, though, there was a high chance that the same fate would still await them. Quinagoff tried to place herself between Reyes and the crowd, but Reyes was having none of it. She might be his bodyguard, but he had been brought up in human society where the men did all they could to protect the women. Now, Reyes was certain that his slim body wasn't going to afford much protection to Quinagoff, and that she would likely die shortly after he did. Then again, what if he should be wearing armour? Reyes sent a thought command to the Hammerstone. Suddenly his wings and tail were gone. He was human, and the merest moment later he was covered in the armour that Mangloss had given him. This should afford him some protection at least, though he doubted it would be of much use when the arrows were fired at nearly point-blank range. Hold your fire, someone shouted. No one shoot, that's an order. Whoever it was somewhere towards the back of the crowd. Give me room, I'm coming through. Are you still... Quinagoff sounded a little worried. It's still me, Reyes assured her. What's going on, my chief? Quinagoff asked, seeming to be on the edge of panic. Stay calm, Reyes replied. He couldn't help a quick glance up in the sky, hoping that Tanegi was also keeping calm. He couldn't see her, but somehow that wasn't all that surprising in this weather. The well-disciplined soldiers kept silent as the man who had spoken made his way to the front of the crowd. The man was wearing heavy plate armour of a knight and carried a two-handed sword strapped to his back. The armour was very old and had gone rusty in places. The bright design that had once decorated the front had been worn down to little more than a suggestion. Race them off, the man exclaimed. He spoke loudly enough so that everyone in the camp could hear. Reyes lifted the visor of his helmet and replied, Sir Grant, good to see you. Last time I saw Anita, she was worried about you. She's always worried about me, Sir Grant replied. Pointing at Quinagoff, this is Gagaro, I presume. Reyes turned his head to look at Quinagoff. She had gone back to warming herself by the fire and was clearly trying to ignore the knight. Reyes wasn't certain, but he had the feeling that Quinagoff was also a little scared of Reyes at that moment. No, Reyes said, that's Quinagoff, one of my bodyguards. The other is flying overhead somewhere, waiting for me to give her the all clear. If you don't mind, I'd like to call her in so she can warm herself by the fire. Is she safe? Sir Grant asked. Are any of us safe? Reyes replied. If you mean is she dangerous, only to my enemies. Then she may come in, Sir Grant said uncertainly. Reyes looked up at the sky. Tanegi could be up there anywhere, but if he knew his bodyguard, then whenever she was keeping an eye on every move he made. He beckoned to the sky. Tanegi landed a mere couple of seconds later. She took one look at Reyes in his armour and shook her head, saying, I don't like it. At least she didn't seem to be as scared of Reyes as Quinagoff had gotten. Tanegi then walked slowly over to the fire where Quinagoff was already warming herself. Reyes watched her for a moment and then used his ring to change back to his natural form. I hope you don't mind. This is simply far more comfortable for me. I don't mind, Sir Grant replied. Then he turned and addressed the soldiers in general. This is Reyes de Moff. Regardless of how he might appear, he has proven to be one of the greatest assets this nation has ever known. It is thanks to Reyes and his girlfriend that we still have a king, and that Princess Jenny is still alive. Reyes is a noble of the House de Moff, and he is a knight, awarded that title by the king himself. He is not to be harmed for any reason whatsoever. I hope that is clear. However strong Sir Grant's praise of Reyes may have been, the soldiers didn't disperse. A harpy landing in the middle of the camp was simply too much of a spectacle. Thank you, Reyes said with feeling. I'm glad you're on our side, Sir Grant replied. After all, I'm the one who trained you how to use your sword. Reyes grinned. Is my brother here? Reyes wasn't sure he wanted to meet his brother. The last time they had met, Greyforth had been trying to aid in his escape from the old king and the death sentence that was still hanging over his head. Previous to that, though, Greyforth had merely tolerated Reyes' existence. His hatred for all things harpy was well documented throughout Floreth, and even as far afield as the mountains in the lands of the Thousand Tribes. Greyforth might be willing to accept Reyes, but how would he react to Quinagoff and Tanegi? I'm here. Greyforth was standing not all that far away, watching the exchange between Reyes and Sir Grant with interest. He was wearing the same armour that Reyes had occasionally seen him wearing around the castle. It was very old, and like Sir Grant's armour, parts of it needed to be replaced. Hello, brother, Reyes replied, taking a couple of uncertain steps towards Greyforth. Sir Grant might have gotten the soldiers in the camp on his side, but Greyforth was the Duke, and hardly bound by the orders of one of his knights. As Reyes approached his brother, He became painfully aware that he was leaving the comforting warmth of the fire. As his feet made a path through the freezing cold snow, they began to feel very numb. "Reyes," Greyforth greeted. "I never thought I'd be saying this about one of your race, but it's good to see you." In his wildest dreams, Reyes had never imagined that his brother would greet him in such a way. In a wave of emotion, Reyes walked right up to his brother and wrapped his arms around him in a tight hug. Greyforth seemed uncertain how to react at first. "Hey, people will talk." Then, although he remained a little reluctant, Greyforth reciprocated, holding Reyes only gently. "Mind my wings, brother," Reyes voiced. "It's a moment of history," Sigrad commented. "Greyforth and a harpy in a hug." "I warned you," Greyforth repeated. "People will talk." There was a little bit of restrained laughter from the gathered soldiers. Greyforth grunted as he and Reyes parted, and when he next spoke it sounded as if his voice had dropped an octave lower. "So, what are you doing back here?" "I'm on my way back after running an errand for Mangloss," Reyes explained. "It's all part of the master plan to win King Goatee's country back." Greyforth nodded. "As the grant intimated, you've proven yourself to be quite the asset. Whoever thought that one day I would actually feel any trust for a harpy? I almost wish we'd had more of you on our side." "Me too," Reyes grinned. "So what are you doing here? I mean, you're right out in the open here." "There's a small army of pointers gathered out there. This morning it was just a few regiments of skirmishers that we thought we might be able to handle, but now they've brought in some heavier troops, and they're between us and the encampment." "Oh," Reyes commented. "Now, I have no doubt we could break through the enemy lines, but if we tried, someone would almost bound to see us entering the encampment, and the game would be up." Reyes nodded. "I can see that might prove to be a problem." "It's almost as if they're out there looking for the encampment," Greyforth commented. "I have no wish to tell them where the door is, and then I guess it's lucky I arrived when I did," Reyes commented. "Oh?" Greyforth seemed uncertain. "I'm a harpy," Reyes explained. "I doubt my presence will even raise an eyebrow. I can come and go through the elven lines with little or no fear. I just need to make sure no one is looking when I enter the encampment." "And how does that help us?" Greyforth asked. "Mangloss has something that will help," Reyes explained. "Once I fetch that, I'll be able to smuggle you all into the encampment, and the elves need not be any the wiser." "I hope you're right," Greyforth voiced. He rested an armoured hand gently on Reyes' shoulder. "Good luck." Reyes nodded. "To you too. It'll take me a while to get back there. You might want to use that time to break camp and prepare to leave. Best not leave anything useful that the pointers can use." Strange how easily Reyes found it to adopt Greyforth's word for the elves. "Quite," Greyforth replied. "We'll see you sometime soon then, brother." "I promise I'll be back before dawn," Reyes replied. It felt so good to hear Greyforth refer to him as his brother. "We'll be waiting," Greyforth said. Reyes turned to his two bodyguards, still warming themselves by the fire. "Are you two warm enough yet?" "Just a few minutes longer," Tanegi pleaded. "Come on," Reyes insisted. "We have to get home."